In the Barca style, my position is somewhat complicated to execute. There are no players with that profile now, but I think Nico Gonzalez could be the best player for it. Those are the words of none other than Sergio Busquets, who back in 2022 suggested Nico could follow in the footsteps of himself and perhaps Rodri by becoming one of the best defensive midfielders in the world. But in reality, Nico took a very different positional path. He's not a defensive midfielder. Yet the sentiment behind that quote is what matters, and ultimately, that is why Nico is a perfect player for Manchester City. This is the most important signing of the transfer window. Let me show you why. Whoever City signed this season, the fundamental requirement was clear. They needed a midfielder capable of filling in for Rodri and capable of playing alongside or ahead of him, the fabled 6-8 hybrid. The end goal is not to replace Rodri, but rather to replace Gundogan. And in Nico Gonzalez, City finally have their man. A 6'2", athletic, box-to-box midfielder with a La Masia education. We all know by now that City's biggest issues this season have been defensive, so let's start with Nico's off-ball work. This season, Porto have primarily operated in a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-3-1, with a pivot midfield pairing of Nico and Varela. As the team's chief six, Varela takes on most of the defensive workload, but Nico's off-ball intelligence and positioning are just as crucial to Porto's overall shape and defensive solidity. Now, Nico isn't exactly a tackler. He rarely goes to ground. This graphic highlights the various ways he's recovered possession in the Primera Liga over the past year. Notice how infrequently he resorts to a sliding challenge, instead favouring more proactive interventions, staying on his feet. Much like his compatriots Busquets and Rodri, Nico's defensive game is built on anticipation, spatial awareness, and elite positioning. Rather than relying on reactive traits, he excels at stopping attacks at source, reading danger before it develops. That graphic also illustrates the sheer volume of Nico's counter-pressing, an area where City once excelled but have faltered this season. Too often, when City lose possession in the final third, opponents escape their press with ease, playing through a midfield that lacks the physicality to sustain high-intensity pressure. Kovacic and Gundogan simply don't have the athletic profile to impose themselves in these moments. Nico, on the other hand, does, and he does so relentlessly. Averaging over 4.5 counter-pressing recoveries per 90, he ranks among the most effective pressing midfielders in Portugal, consistently disrupting opposition build-up before it even begins. The intensity of Nico's pressing doesn't just win possession and control, it directly leads to immediate attacking opportunities and goals. He's an elite player in that regard, recovering possession in the final third more than 2 times per 90. Those defensive interventions directly contributed to 7 goals over the past year, demonstrating the offensive and defensive utility of Nico's ball recovery ability. This level of impact comes down to more than just his fantastic awareness and mental profile. While his ability to read the game is outstanding, his physical attributes are just as crucial. His strength enables him to outmuscle opponents, win duels and second balls, and retain possession. His long legs allow him to spring onto loose balls and capitalize on sloppy touches. His powerful strides are ideal for eating up space in transition and covering ground effortlessly and quickly. That kind of defensive presence has been sorely lacking in City's midfield this season. Nico's combination of anticipation, intensity, and physicality would provide an immediate upgrade, restoring the kind of defensive solidity and counter-pressing edge that once made City so dominant. Moreover, Nico's appreciation of space and use of his body isn't limited to defensive situations. It makes him a threat in the opposition box too, particularly when it comes to attacking set pieces. He scored 5 league goals this season, 3 of which have been from set pieces, with Foden delivering corners from the right and Marmoush from the left. I'd expect Nico to contribute his fair share of threat from dead balls. So clearly, defensively, Nico is a plug-and-play upgrade for City. How does he fare in possession? In Rodri's absence, City haven't just lost their primary deep-lying passer, they've lost their most reliable build-up receiver. Without him, the team struggles to progress the ball and play through pressure, often looking disconnected and frail in midfield. There's no clear bridge between the deeper midfielders and the attacking unit, making it far harder for City's attackers to impact the game in a meaningful way. The question is, Can Nico fill that void? Instinctively, given Nico's build, you could be forgiven for thinking he's a bit heavy-footed on the ball. But whilst he doesn't have the nimble frame of a stereotypical La Masia graduate, this is still a La Masia graduate we're talking about here. Nico is deceptively comfortable on the ball, combining technical quality with impressive physicality. His first touch and close control allow him to receive possession under pressure with his back to goal, while his strength helps him shield the ball, turn, and drive forward with power, rarely getting shrugged off. He's also more mobile and agile than you might expect, which makes him comfortable in tight spaces. When you combine this technical assurance with strength and power, you get a midfielder who simply doesn't lose possession in dangerous areas, and we all know how crucial that is to Pep. Just look at where he sits on this chart. The further left, the fewer losses per 90. Given the high volume of passes he executes and receives, that level of ball retention is absurd. Now, I'm not saying he's a mix of Declan Rice and Rodri, but he kind of is. He's a great runner and carrier and can maintain composure and control in the smaller spaces. Beyond that, he'd improve City's connectivity between defence and attack, consistently finding players like Foden in the pockets or picking out Marmoush's runs. Across Europe's top 7 leagues this season, he ranks in the top 15% for forward passes and the top 10% for forward pass completion among midfielders. I'm also really impressed by his long passing and ability to switch play. Nico scans the pitch, picks his head up, and finds teammates with fantastic precision. That would be a huge asset from an overload to isolate perspective. Players like Doku and Savio in particular would thrive off those switches, something we just don't see enough from Kovacic, Gundogan, or Bernardo. But, as always, I have to point out some of his flaws. At 23, he's far from the finished article, and there's significant room for development and growth. For example, one area of concern I have is his aerial ability. I think he's inconsistent when it comes to defensive aerial duels. He wins a lot of aerial duels, the 7th most for a midfielder in Portugal this season. That sounds great. But his success rate is pretty mediocre and underwhelming given his height and bulk, just 40%. On top of that, he has a tendency to attack the ball without directing it effectively, a flaw he shares with Ruben Diaz. Too often, the focus is on winning the header rather than placing it towards a teammate. It's not a major red flag, it's not like it happens all the time, but it's surprising how frequently this deficiency crops up, given how composed he is in other areas of his game. It's also important to note that, despite his qualities, Nico isn't a completely versatile midfielder. While he's played multiple roles for Porto, even playing as a 10 at times, he would struggle as a lone pivot in City's 3-1 build. He's good, but he's not Rodri. He's not a pure defensive midfielder or a metronomic controller, and expecting him to be would be unfair. That said, he'd still be a significant upgrade on Kovacic as a lone pivot, though realistically, it makes far more sense to play both Nico and Kovacic in a double pivot midfield. Kovacic has, understandably, struggled with carrying the burden of Rodri's responsibilities. Partnership with Nico would go a long way to alleviate Kovacic's plight. Looking ahead to next season, once Rodri returns, Nico could either play alongside him, or, if Pep reverts to a 3-1 shape, he could feature on either side of the midfield diamond. Now, does Nico single-handedly fix City? No. No one player can. Another central midfielder will need to be signed in the summer to help complete this rebuild. At just 23, he shouldn't be viewed as the saviour of City's season, who needs time to adapt, and given the current struggles at City, he'll be thrown into a baptism of fire. But that's exactly what the rest of this season should be about, integrating him, letting him benefit from Pep's coaching, and setting him up for success next year. The reason I opened this video by calling this the most important signing of the window is simple. It addresses the fundamental, systemic issues that have plagued City this season and last. In the short term, Nico's presence should elevate every player around him. In the long term, City finally have a proper deputy and partner for Rodri, someone who can complement his skill set and mitigate his weaknesses. This is the most important signing of the transfer window, because once the duo of Rodri and Nico Gonzalez is established, once those two form a partnership, City will have gone from one of the weakest midfields in the Premier League to the best midfield in the world. That's the video. Huge thanks to my backers who make content like this possible. A Vitor Hayes analysis is in the works, so stay tuned for that. And if you missed my breakdowns of Kusanov and Marmoush, Click on your screen now to check those out. They're good, I promise.